It's got to be positive, inclusive, reaching out across the country. So wherever you are across the country, feeling that we're the party of hope and aspiration. If you want to get on in life, we're going to back you, basically. If you want to, get your kids into great schools and have choice in education, we're the party that's going to make that happen. If you want to set up a business or, do something different, have a career change, we are the ones that give you the good old-fashioned traditional ladder of opportunity to get on in life and have the freedom to succeed and live your life freely. We don't feel that way at all right now about our party. And certainly when we're up against a Labour government, when we look at how they're now going to strip away our freedoms, become much more centralised, control of the state, we're going to be so far removed from all of that. So we're going to have to absolutely create a new outward face, I think, a new vision for our country, but one that meets the genuine challenges that the British public and our nation faces today, tomorrow and in the future.
I'm Ben Houchin. This is the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home, and we're going to lift the lid on centre-right politics in the UK. We're going to be speaking with influential figures from across the political spectrum to help understand how we can make centre-right politics relevant to people's lives again and turn it back into a political force for good. Welcome, everybody, to the Blueprint Podcast. Today's guest is Priti Patel. Many of you will know her, but some of you may not. Priti Patel is the Member of Parliament for Whittam. Since 2010. I was just corrected before the podcast that it's not Witham, it's Whittam. Priti studied economics at Keele University and earned a postgraduate degree from the University of Essex, but actually in politics, Priti Patel has held a number of very high-profile roles, from the Secretary of State for International Development, Home Secretary, and I think it's fair to say I think Priti has a reputation for being known for her tough stance on things like immigration, law enforcement, has been a huge champion for the Conservative membership as a campaigner and a self-professed campaigner rather than politician. Right. So, Priti, welcome to the Blueprint Podcast. Very brief introduction on the politics of it there. And again, lots of people listening to this will know your political background, but I suspect lots of people probably don't know your personal background anywhere near as well. So tell us a little bit more about Priti Patel before politics, where you're from, your journey, where you grew up, but also how you got into politics as well.
So bizarrely, this will sound strange, but I have lived in different parts of the country because my mum and dad were shopkeepers. So clearly I'm the daughter of immigrants. My parents came here from Uganda and settled wherever they bought a shop, basically. So I've lived in Cheshunt in Hertfordshire, I've lived in Newcastle in Norwich, and we've lived in Radlett in Hertfordshire as well, where we had a shop called the Chocolate Box on the High Street.
All right.
So, I am literally the daughter of shopkeepers, and that has defined me. It really has. That work ethic, 7-day-a-week culture, from stuff in newspapers to doing newspaper rounds to doing cash and carry after school. And the person that conscripted me, dare I say, or signed me up to the Conservative Party was my local Member of Parliament. So it was Cecil Parkinson. So Cecil was the Member of Parliament for Hertsmere, and my mum and dad's shop was in Hertsmere on Radlett High Street. And Cecil came into my dad's shop. I will never forget this. I was behind the counter, probably reading smash hits, actually. I'm not going to pretend I was reading the Financial Times. I was definitely reading
smash hits. I mean, that was a great.
There you go.
Yeah, it was a great magazine in the 90s.
Well, it's probably a combination of smash hits and Kerrang, because I like rock music as well. And he came into the shop and said to me, literally, "Isn't it about time, young lady, you joined the Conservative Party?"
Right. And how old were you then?
So I was possibly, I think, just below 18. So, about to go to university, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I always worked in my dad's shop. And I thought, I can't really argue against that, can I? Cecil Parkinson, pretty well known, not just MP, member of the cabinet, he knows Margaret Thatcher, all that kind of stuff. And that for me just became a lifetime. My sort of, me entering the Conservative family, my love of the Conservative Party, but everything that I stood for as well. And it's so interesting now, Ben, when you think about it. I get asked about how we're going to get more young people into our party. For me, and actually at that time in particular, the Conservative Party naturally appealed to young people because it was the party of freedom, of, if you want to get on in life, literally if you want to get on in life, it was our party that gave you the stepping stones, the hand up to get on in life, the party of enterprise. If you wanted to work hard, earn lots of money, be successful, set up your own business, have the freedom to succeed, which quite frankly are my Conservative values, our party was associated with it. I wasn't exactly one of those to sort of join protest marches and stand with placards or be a member of the Labour Party. That's not me at all. And I think because of my upbringing, the daughter of a shopkeeper, we went from shop to shop, business to business. My father went on to have other businesses as well. You learn at a very early age that it's hard work that actually gives you your economic security, but also your economic freedoms and how you live your life. So that is me to a T. That really is.
But I assume, I know you've just expanded on it a bit there, but Cecil walking into the shop was not the epiphany you had of, I'm a Conservative.
Oh, no.
And that was when you were 17, 18.
Yeah.
When did you start to realise that you were a Conservative?
So actually it was while I was growing up. So my parents still live in the same house that lived in since about 1982, 83.
Are they still there now?
They're still there now. My father, I'll never forget him saying this. He basically said, we owned this house. And he was extending the house as well, actually, at the time. We can only do this because of the freedoms and the success that actually this country and this government has given us. And with that, my family, economic security and economic freedoms matter to us a lot. So I think when you come from a culture where you're basically removed from the country that you've lived in or been brought up in, you always have a degree of insecurity around you. And my father always Margaret Thatcher. It's because of her. Successive Conservative governments have given us the freedom to do this, be secure, be part of this community and country, and have the success of, being in a house where they still live, but being able to extend it, and then buying a car or, all those types of things. I still remember Margaret Thatcher and some of her speeches that, as people earn more, they own more. It's that freedom. And so I grew up, and obviously I'd read about it. I've always been interested in current affairs. Being in a shop, newsagents, I used to read all the newspapers.
It's in your face all the time,
And so share ownership, for example. I used to, on the front page of the Financial Times, you used to peel off a card where it'll give you the calling numbers, where you could literally phone up a stockbroker and, make share deals and transactions.
Wow.
So I was fascinated by all of that.
Is that where the interest in economics came from?
So and business, absolutely. And my father, he used to have a desk at home, possibly a little bit smaller than this table here where we're sitting at, and it used to be covered in VAT returns because he was always going to cash and carry, and the green books where you'd have to put your VAT receipts and everything else in. If I come home from school and I want to sit down to do my homework, I would have to move all these papers out of the way, and my dad would go nuts. It's just like, I've just done that, Bolzer. Yeah, I've just done that one. Don't touch that one. In the end, I would start to do the VAT returns for him. So, that's just how it is. When you're in a family business and you grew up in that type of environment, you always end up, I used to sit with a red pen, literally entering the numbers from the various receipts that my dad would have for his VAT returns. So I still have a red pen in my bag, always. So whenever I'm making notes, I don't just write in blue or black. I still have a red pen around me. It's one of those things that you grow up with.
Do you think, because I find this fascinating, particularly when you're talking about your parents who came across from Uganda, I've always found it really fascinating that we've not done more with the general immigrant community. We saw it with the Jewish influx in the early 1900s. You look at the Muslim community, the Hindu community, very entrepreneurial, huge work ethic. But we seem to struggle. You're suggesting maybe back in the 80s this was different, but in the 90s it was different. But now we seem to struggle to be able to help them identify with the Conservative Party. Where do you think the disconnect is? Because, like I say, naturally I feel like they should be Conservative.
So it's a really good question. So I grew up being quite affronted, actually, that my community, effectively the Indian diaspora community, always associated themselves with the Labour Party. So if you look at the...
Where did that come from?
So you remember the electoral map. So if you look at places sort of in around London, I lived in Harrow for a little bit as a child, and it was, close to Harrow, where certain communities were, Southall, then Wembley, quite Labour. And then Leicester, always Labour MPs, all this kind of stuff. And I could never work it out because certainly I'm from the Gujarati community and background. Always, we 7 days a week working, making big sacrifices, all of that kind of stuff. Instinctively, these are Conservative values.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it wasn't until I became sort of proper political, so, active in the party, I would just sort of speak up a bit about this, that we need to be resonating much more widely. But I think the real moment for me was clearly standing for Parliament, first time round in 2005, and then getting elected in 2010. And I do actually remember, post that 2010 election, obviously coalition government, I remember talking to our party and even to David Cameron at the time, saying, we've got to stop all this nonsense that, we can't appeal to diaspora communities. Classic example I gave David Cameron at the time was that there are just under 2 million Indian diaspora in the United Kingdom. A lot of them are Gujarati, so they come from the state of Gujarat. We're also going to big Indian elections back in India. And in fact, Prime Minister Modi was just a candidate back then. And I said, there's a huge interest in what goes on in India, as well as what goes on in the politics in our own country from the Indian diaspora. Don't you think we should be marrying that up some way and actually appealing to the Indian community? So David's answer to this was, he gave me this ridiculous job title, but it was a real privilege, actually. I became the Conservative government's Indian diaspora champion. So I went around the country actually talking to our community, going to events and all this kind of stuff. I took David to certain events as well. I remember in the 2015 election, we went to Gurdwara in Gravesham, actually, and it was super. And I think that's when people started to resonate with us politically. So, but if you look at our party now, peel it back, we have more councillors, for example, from the diaspora background, Indian diaspora background. We've got more people, we've got Shivani in Parliament now as well, which is super. And we've had others try to stand. We had Amit Jogo, who stood in Hendon this year as well. People are coming forward. And I have really felt it, actually, that, as someone that I guess has been the first female part of the Indian diaspora being successfully elected to Parliament, we pave the way for others. That's a Conservative thing. You pave the way for others to come forward.
It's interesting. I remember having a long conversation with Richard Harrington many years ago, and he kind of said the same thing about the Jewish community in the early 1900s. Yeah. I mean, they were a key part of the trade union movement back in the early 1900s, like real labour kind of benchmark really for the labour movement, the socialist movement. And actually, if you fast forward now 100 years, it's almost kind of a generational thing. Again, same thing. Those kind of principles and ideals of entrepreneurialism, natural conservatism. Now you would argue the Jewish community is absolutely a conservative community. It feels to me the Indian community has been on that journey as well over many, many years.
But definitely has.
Definitely. What is it in kind of those first, second, sometimes third generation Indian and Muslim communities in particular now than the Jewish community? What's stopping them from instinctively going to the Conservative Party despite those values? And what takes that time?
So I don't think that's true for sort of my community with the Indian Hindu community. I mean, the Jewish community parallels are really very significant. Right. So when people first came over here, 60s and 70s, being employed was difficult. So a lot of manual labour then become unionised, and hence that sort of background association with the Labour movement and the Labour Party back in the day, which then carried itself forward, possibly up until maybe, the 2020s, basically, 2010. I think there is a slight difference, and it does depend. So I came from a family. I mean, my dad was just like, when he was buying his shop, he helped to buy his mum and dad a shop, first of all, which was in Tottenham, White Hart Lane. And
you were a Tottenham fan?
I was born in Highbury, so There you go. So I'm an Islington girl, and my football team are not Spurs. They're really not. But through what was so interesting back then is it's aspiration. Generation after generation improves themselves in that conservative way. Like I said, economic freedom, economic security, wanting your children, as we all do, we want our children to become successful, be better. But my dad was one of those that he chose not to. We had a home in Harrow, but he chose not to basically say, we're just going to live within the Indian community. That's why I lived in Norfolk. I lived in rural Norfolk as a child for about 4 or 5 years, maybe about 4 years.
What was the reason for that? Why?
He bought a shop up there.
But why not?
Because he wanted to go somewhere different.
Right.
He wanted to sort of see Britain in a different way.
Up sticks with everybody we're moving to Norfolk.
And my dad was like that. And he was always, Britain is our home. And we get on in life, we integrate. So I joined the Girl Guides. I went out, rode horses and, performed at the Norfolk County Show every year and all that kind of stuff. That, for my dad, was just like, that's what we do. And I guess one of the challenges we have now, I don't think it applies to the Indian community, but certainly we're seeing this around the debates around integration, for example. My views are very clear. If you come to our country legally and you settle in our country, you subscribe to the British way of life, respect our institutions, you integrate, speak the language, all this kind of stuff. That was what I grew up with. I grew up with that. And I think certainly within the Indian diaspora community from that generation that came over 60s, 70s and throughout the 80s, that was our norm. And don't forget, that's a generation that came to this country, a bit like the Jewish community as well. There was nothing for us. You literally had to find your own way, which my parents did, grandparents did, other family members did. Some didn't even stay in the UK, by the way. They went to America, they went to different parts of the world. I've got a very international family. So I think there's, always speaking quite pragmatically, there's always more we can do here. As a party, there's more we can do to broaden our appeal, to get people to join us, while at the same time talk about, being proud of our country, proud of our values, and integrating in our country.
And that brings me on to, I suppose, you're standing for the leadership, which is why you've kindly agreed to come on the Blueprint podcast. What made you, you've been around politics a long time now. You talked, first standing in 2005, elected in 2010, holding lots of very important roles that you've, I think, managed very, very successfully. Why now stand for the leadership? What is it that means that you've decided to put yourself forward, and why now?
So a few things, actually. Our party's in a terrible state. I think we just have to be honest about that. Election was awful. By that I mean the election result. And we are at what I hope will be our lowest point. And I feel like, as a lifelong member of the Conservative Party, I've been a member of the party for 3 decades. I feel that through my experience, certainly, I, like so many of us, we're custodians of this great party. We need to leave the party eventually in a better shape than it was when we joined it. We have a duty and a responsibility to do that, because our values are successful values. They are enduring values. Conservatism hasn't failed. And now is a time to have someone leading our party that's prepared to make that case all over again, which is why I'm doing this, because I've got a 16-year-old son. I don't want him living his life in a socialist country, basically, with this awful ideological Labour government. So for me, this is my moment to step up for all of us, basically. As custodians of the party, we always also think that the one thing the Conservatives consistently do is that we ensure that we do right for current generations, but also for future generations in terms of the type of society that we're handing over to them. And now is the time for me to step up and play a part in that.
And I know it's something you've talked about. I've been to a couple of hustings there, you've spoken, and we've talked separately about it. I think one of the big things that came through from the general election is people kind of lost sight of what the Conservative Party stands for. And I suppose as a leadership candidate, people listening to the Blueprint podcast, members, and actually the wider public, what is the Priti Patel Conservative Party if you were to become leader? What does the Conservative Party stand for in your eyes, and what would it stand for if you became the leader?
So first of all, a very positive outlook in life. Going back to being a right-of-centre Conservative Party, because if
Do you not think with that at the moment?
Well, you've just said it. Over the last 2 years in the general election, people just did not know what we stood for.
Yeah.
They said a lot of other things as well, which we're happy to talk about. But we were sort of a mushy shade of blue, a mushy shade of yellow, a mushy shade of whatever the colour was going, in whichever part of the country. We've got to stop that. Because coming back to my earlier comment, conservatism has not failed. And fundamentally, we moved away from the British people. I'm not going to, the people did not move away from us. We let them down. We moved away from them. And so you've asked me sort of the Priti Patel view of conservatism. It is actually about freedom. It's the freedom to live your life. In our great country, and our country is a great country, it does make me a bit cross when you hear people run our country down, but also run our party down as well. And it comes back to our values, our beliefs. We do believe in, the openness, the freedom to succeed. I remember the days when actually my dad used to tell me to do this when I was a kid in Norfolk. Get on your bike and go and check up on Mrs. Smith, for example. Being part of the community. serving your community and serving our country. That's really when conservatism is at its best and doing really well. And when we appeal to the public, when we're talking about the issues that matter to them, not as I would describe the sidebar issues that we all want to just sort of get consumed about in Westminster. And again, we moved away from the public. We moved away from their hopes and aspirations around the discussions around providing the economic security for them and their family. Everyone has a lot of anxiety. You know, when you think about the state of the world right now, Russia, Ukraine, the way energy bills have gone over recent years, the cost of living crisis, were we in that space, hand on heart, where we could actually feel the anxiety, the concerns of the British people, understand some of the, you know, the real stresses that they were going through? During this campaign, many people said to me directly that your party is out of touch. You really don't understand the British public. You're all too busy in Westminster fighting amongst yourself, not even talking amongst yourselves, just sort of squabbling amongst yourself. So it comes back to who we are, our values and beliefs, a party of principle and integrity. I think we need to raise the bar now when it comes to some standards, public standards, how we conduct ourselves. The last few years have not been particularly good. And then how we actually win back people. And it is by being authentic, but also actually now in opposition, coming up with practical policies that are deliverable, not just stuff that sounds nice and, you know, will just sort of make people feel good for 30 seconds. And, oh, yeah, they're going to do this, that and the other, but without a plan for delivery.
Well, I think, and you've also touched upon this, but and I'm a big believer that, you know, we got elected 4 times in a row, you know, 10 years of Conservative government, people seem pretty content with. You know, what is it that what went wrong between 2019 and the election in 2024? How did we move so far away from the public?
Too much went wrong. To be fair, Ben.
Let's start.
Let's
start with the long list.
So, I mean, well, first of all, just go back to 2019 and just think back and capture that sort of energy and enthusiasm. How when we actually were very successful in that general election, 80-seat majority, we actually carried the hopes and aspirations of the British public in a really big way. So there was a lot around Brexit, obviously some great, you know, later on, levelling up, you know, real sort of, you know, the ability to transform the country. I mean, that was the mantra. From my perspective, I was Home Secretary, so much more law and order, you know, 20,000 police officers, really trying to sort things out. And then, of course, we had the pandemic. Pandemic changed everything. It almost froze our way of life, but in a way in which it was state control, basically, which we actually loathe. We don't like that, actually, as Conservatives and as a party. So
how comfortably were you with that then at the time, given that you were in?
So it was really difficult, and I'll be very candid. I mean, even to this day, I gave evidence at the COVID inquiry earlier on this year, but just the fact that I was worried about public order, you know, shutting down society, that is not a good thing to do. But, you know, looking back now, and even at the COVID inquiry and all the papers that we read at the time and subsequently, you know, how decisions are made based on actually sage advice, medical advice, particular strand of advice that as a government, we collectively take decisions and we are all responsible for those decisions and choices. And I'm the first to put my hand up and say, you know, might not have been great, but we were one team and you go through all of that. So I think actually that became not just a big test for us all, but actually I think it had that knock-on impact in terms of how government was viewed. Expectations of government as we came out of the pandemic. So great things, vaccine, furlough was a massive protection for people at the time. And then in terms of how people felt about the government afterwards, you know, getting back to normality. But straight away, if you recall, we had all the issues around what followed with our own leadership at the time. And it just became this sort of doom loop. And very inward looking, actually, very, very inward looking. And I think that's effectively where the spiral went downwards, rather than that spiral of positivity that we had in 2019 with the election, when the spiral, you know, was going upwards rather than downwards.
Do you think we overpromised in 2019 though? Because, I mean, it was such
I'm not sure about that. No? I'm not sure, because the manifesto was a clear manifesto and a good manifesto. Certainly from a Home Affairs perspective, I delivered, by the time I'd left in 2022, so 2 years ago, the majority of what we had said had been delivered. So structural changes to immigration, the ability to, leverage up, downwards immigration figures and numbers, have a lever, that's a points-based system. We failed absolutely on immigration, on illegal migration. I think that became a soap opera, quite frankly, over the last 2 years. We had good policies and legislation in place which were undelivered. The Nationality and Borders Act, the new plan for immigration was never fully delivered. And that was government policy, collective government, decision-making in Cabinet. I remember presenting it all to Cabinet and having those discussions. Everyone agreed. It was never fully delivered. So I think at that level, yes. But if you ratchet up promises and then you fail to deliver, then clearly that became a major factor during the election. Hence reform on immigration issues. We weren't articulate enough on these issues. We looked like we were arguing amongst ourselves certainly on the migration issues without actually unpacking it a lot more on differentiation between legal and illegal migration.
Which I think is still something that we don't differentiate enough on. I mean, my personal belief is that I don't think we overpromised. We've got to play devil's advocate on these things to get your view on it. But it kind of felt to me like we had a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change the country for the better, and COVID got in the way of that. I mean, the state apparatus didn't just grind to a halt, but the impact of COVID after COVID that we're still feeling today, I think can, in theory, make us reflect on the wrong issues as a Conservative Party. I mean, we're looking forward now, aren't we, to potentially yourself as the leader, but a new Conservative Party. And I think people look at it as if 2019, or some people certainly think 2019 was the problem. Certainly people outside of our party kind of see 2019 as something that they just viscerally dislike.
Well, that's an excuse for them, isn't it?
It is,
basically.
It is, but they ignore...
And they rewrite history. They're all trying to rewrite history now as well.
And they ignore COVID in the middle of it as if that wasn't an impact on how that administration tried to deliver its agenda.
And that's a major problem, I think, for us, because everybody's sort of... Well, not everyone. People have airbrushed that entire period. And COVID fundamentally changed our ability to get stuff done afterwards. That said, I mean, I managed to still deliver my legislation even after COVID. It was hard, but we still got stuff done. We still got things through on the statute book. We still carried on governing, and I did not lose time at all. I can't speak for other government departments where priorities would have shifted, but you have to be totally focused and resolute, which I was. I was absolutely focused in knowing in my bailiwick what I had to do and just sticking with that. But looking back, clearly the public, sort of see things through a very, I guess,
And why is that?
A kaleidoscope, I think, is probably the way.
That's a political failure? Is that a messaging failure? Or is that
It's a combination of all of it, in my view. We did not even in this election speak about some of the great successes, and not just since 2019. I thought Levelling Up was a great mission, really, really was. And it's travesty, actually, that the Labour government wants to take it away, because it's transformational for communities. As Conservatives, we believe in this, right? So a lot of the work that you do, Ben. But actually on the economy, I was part of a Treasury team in 2014 that, came up with, we worked towards that long-term economic plan, lower taxes, and in DWP, help more people get back into work. We delivered on universal credit, creating that pathway to sustainable employment, to giving people that hands up in life, based on Conservative traditions and values. We stopped speaking about actually the way in which we change people's lives and our record of delivery. And that's a failure, actually. That is a political failure. And I don't think we should move away from that, because even now we're in opposition. These are great foundations for us to build on for the next set of the battle of ideas, the policy prospectuses that we start to develop. Welfare is still more and more relevant with the number of people now on in-work benefits and on welfare. The fact that our labour market, we're still reliant on migration to fill jobs. The fact that the apprenticeship levy, in my view, is not working. It's too sticky, and we need to really free it up so that SMEs can tap into it and it starts to deliver on the skills agenda. I think we should be looking at proper labour market strategies for our country going forward. These are all good, exciting policies. They're all positive because they're positive for the British people, but they're also positive for communities around the country and can also help to transform certain parts of the country and communities that, coming back to the levelling up point, feel left behind.
Absolutely. And I think you've touched upon it a couple of times with immigration. And one thing I didn't know until quite recently, that you were the architect of the Rwanda plan. And to be fair, I've been listening and reading some of the things in recent weeks that I think probably have been unfairly attributed to you, Priti. So I thought it was probably worth kind of diving into that. One, You've talked about being the architect of the Rwanda plan. Question number one, I suppose, what happened to the Rwanda plan? Is it what you envisaged? Did it change? And if it wasn't what you envisaged, how would you implement it if you were the leader of the party?
So it's moved forward now, or moved on, I should say, not quite forward, because it's actually hit the buffers and it's been just completely canned by the Labour government. There is now we brought in, the last government, I wasn't in that government, the Safety of Rwanda Act. But if you go right back to 2022, April 22, the partnership I'd negotiated with the government of Rwanda was a migration and economic development partnership deal. And that's a world away from the Act of Parliament that we brought in that has just been canned by Labour. And it was a resettlement programme, because the logic behind all of this was very, very clear. Illegal migration around the world is in a terrible state. And no one country has sought to tackle it in the way in which we have put the prospectus forward, which was a new plan for immigration, reforming the end-to-end asylum system, and within it, looking for a third country where you remove those that come to our country illegally, even processing their claims in Rwanda, but importantly, helping them to resettle and rebuild their lives in Rwanda. And the government of Rwanda were absolutely focused and very keen on this, because in their own words, they themselves have seen too many young men from East Africa, from Rwanda, be trafficked by the people smugglers, cross the Sahel, cross the Mediterranean, have their lives put at risk and in jeopardy, and they wanted to be part of the solution to stop that. And working with us and working with me at the time, they wanted to set a new bar within the international community about how we resettle people in the right way, in a positive way, invest in people, invest in their skills, help them rebuild their lives. So we saw plenty of pictures of the type of accommodation that people would be living in Rwanda when they would be sent to Rwanda to have their claims processed. But access to education, skill development, those types of things were absolutely part of that development program. And that's what it's called economic development and migration package, because it's people migrating through the third country removal scheme, but also being invested in through that economic development program. And Rwanda is a country that is built on refugees. So people have resettled in Rwanda, gone on to become successful business people, for example. Sounds familiar from the start of this conversation, doesn't it? So it is a good, proactive and positive step forward. But sadly, it was completely demonised. And
did it change, or was it more the communications of how it was?
I think it was the communications.
Right, okay.
Completely, it was the communications. And part of the communication, well, because it went through a whole legal process. So my first flight was stopped by something called Rule 39, which then went to the domestic courts.
Can you just explain for listeners?
So Rule 39 was basically where we were prevented from getting the flight off, but it was another issue of last-minute claims through Rule 39, which was a Strasbourg judge basically preventing us from actually removing the said individuals on a plane to Rwanda. And it was a last-minute claim. So you've heard all sorts of language used around last-minute judges and all this kind of stuff. But part of the way in which we could tackle that would have been through our domestic courts and through the reforms that I put in place with the National Anti-Borders Act, the one-stop shop on immigration courts and tribunals, where you can't come up with last-minute claims anymore. All your claims have to be heard once at an immigrations tribunal hearing. But we never implemented that. We never brought forward the reform. So by the time I left the Home Office...
The legislative reform that would have...
So it's all on the statute books. It's all there.
Yeah.
So I brought that forward, but none of those policies were actually implemented or operationalised in the Home Office after I left. So
why was that?
Well, you'll have to ask the people that came in afterwards. And don't forget, it was a merry-go-round at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I think we had a few leaders and we had a few Home Secretaries, and the department was going through a lot of flux. But we still had legal cases going through the court around the efficacy of the Rwanda policy.
But if the legislation was already on the statute books, why do we hear, particularly in the media, around ECHR is something, and it's something that's playing out in the leadership contest, right?
Sure.
That would suggest to me that that's ECHR compliant, and that whole conversation about leaving the ECHR is a bit of a red herring, or is that not quite?
So in my view, it is.
Right?
In my view, it is, because what's the alternative? So let's be devil's advocate here. Leave the ECHR. What's the alternative proposal? A Bill of Rights, Well, we were the party that proposed a Bill of Rights, I think in 2010 and 15. But that would still have to be subject to interpretation by our domestic courts and domestic judges. So, the reality is our legislation currently has been subject to British courts. British courts, and the most recent judgment where the courts said they felt Rwanda was not appropriate, or I don't think they said it was unlawful, because it was a policy of refoulement, which is effectively if an individual is sent to Rwanda, they could be subject to degrading treatment or then returned back to their country of origin and not given fair process. Much of that came about because of the type of language. So you mentioned communications, the type of language that was being used in our own government at the time around illegal migrants, and the terminology and the rhetoric that was being used. And we should just be honest about that. But we did not fully implement our policies, and that has to be the starting point for actually dealing with these issues going forward, because we now have a Labour government that doesn't have a plan. We have levers. We absolutely have levers in terms of what's on the statute book, which actually gives us the opportunity to go back to government, this Labour government, and say, you need to do something about this, and even press them to take action on this.
So the statutes you say that would deal with all of this, were they ever road tested through the ECHR? Because again, you always have the ECHR in the background where, judges will interpret legislation in light of other legislation. And the ECHR, it used to be the European Union, which I appreciate is a separate body.
Separate.
But what you find with judges is they tend to interpret a lot of domestic legislation in light of the ECHR obligations.
Right.
And so, playing devil's advocate, somebody might say, well, okay, you might have had this legislation, but it would have run into the sand because it would have been challenged by ECHR.
Although our legislation was completely road tested through the right kind of lawyers, legal counsel, when you draft it.
Yep.
I actually brought in external lawyers to work on the National Anti-Fraud.
It's almost kind of a fight that you need to have, right? I mean, irrespective of whether it's drafted correctly, which it sounds like it was.
We go through all these processes. But
it never really got...
Ben, I can tell you the amount of legal counsel that we have had that would walk us through, every single possible clause. And actually, it's not just ECHR. The real elephant in the room is the Human Rights Act. And that's effectively where, we should be looking to reform parts of the Human Rights Act, which is certainly within our purview. In Parliament, it's absolutely within our purview. Should we come back into power? And I think even in our time in opposition, we should look to do more in this space.
But the ECHR is also underpinned by
but let me just say,
ECHR.
But parts of the Human Rights Act in particular cause us problems in still removals of, for example, foreign national offenders. So we've been round the sort of doom loop on this. We really have. So we need to learn the lessons. The key thing is we're in opposition right now. We want to develop practical policies that can be implemented and delivered. We have legislation on the statute books which was not even implemented, not even started to be implemented. Well, that should definitely take place. And that's not just Home Office policy, by the way. It cuts across our court system. So immigration courts and tribunals. It cuts across the judiciary. So all of these areas are integrated anyway. But with this, we should be looking at, so what lessons have we learned, through the struggles that we had removing, for example, I had this problem, removing foreign national offenders, my deportation flights to Jamaica, which were, the Labour Party would constantly campaign against me removing the murderers, the rapists, the drug dealers back to Jamaica, and they would find loops in the Human Rights Act to stop us from doing that. So this is where we need to be concentrating our efforts. And by the way, Rwanda is not the sole answer to illegal migration. You have to have a plethora of policies in place, hence the reason why the National Anti-Borders Act was so important. I've mentioned the courts and tribunals, but also the screening around age assessments of the individuals that come to our country. We've not put that in place because we had terrible cases of young men claiming that they were children and then going straight onto the local authority roles on schools and social services.
So there are problems with the system around age, there are problems with the system. Now, are you suggesting that the legislation around this would be able to deal with that if implemented properly?
That is the point about the immigration courts and tribunals. So we have individuals going back to the courts and tribunals with totally cases and claims that are just, they're unfounded. They completely are, where they can go back again and again and again. So, you can go back and say, I cannot leave this country and go back home because I'll be persecuted because of my Christian values. And, then that sort of slows things down. And when you get a removal notice being served, they'll go back to the courts and say, I cannot possibly be removed from this country back home because of my sexuality. So that, 2 years later, then you get another removal notice. They can go back to the courts. I cannot possibly go back home because, I'll be persecuted because of X, Y, Z. That is what the reform of the immigration courts and tribunals would have stopped.
And it's a really interesting point that never gets talked about enough, and you've already just briefly touched upon it, the difference between illegal migration and legal migration. And we see the annual figures, or the monthly figures come out, or the quarterly figures, whatever it's 700,000 people last year, which lumps together the roughly 100,000 asylum seeker applications we get per annum with the legal migration figures of 600,000, which also includes things like students as well. So, how do we as a Conservative Party get a grip of immigration, but help from a communications point of view as well as a policy point of view to not demonise good quality, in effect, good legal migration, where people come here in the right way and want to integrate and become part of our great nation, but not get wrapped up in this this whole nonsense around just illegal migration.
My genuine view on this, we've got to stop being dishonest about all of this, and we have to stop conflating legal and illegal migration. The two are separate. So
I think we do that as a party?
We have done that. We have done that as a government and as a party. Go back. You don't need to go that far back. Just listen to some of the things that members of the last government were saying about migration. Not legal migration over here and then illegal over there. It was just one.
Yep.
And always one number. And did we hear any members of the government actually do the explanation around legal migration? Did we hear anyone speak about British national overseas, people from Hong Kong? We have a historic obligation to people in Hong Kong when the National Security Act came forward, or Russia, Ukraine, or health and social care visas that were granted during the COVID pandemic. We didn't hear about that. We also did not hear about people that have come through the various routes through the points-based system. So we did create specific routes. The Treasury, in fact, asked us to do this in 2020, 21, 22 for investors, tech visas, for the brightest and the best. And it's right that we get the brightest and the best to come to our country. But they're sponsored. So they have to be sponsored. They have to pay thousands of pounds for their visas and thousands of pounds for the immigration health surcharge and for their family if they come over as well. Most of them are net contributors to our country, actually, and high-rate taxpayers when you think about what they're doing and the specialisms that they have. I do not recall hearing anyone from the last government speak about the net contribution legal migrants are making to our country, those that are particularly employed and working. Students naturally, and there was a debate in the party, I suspect probably about 5 years ago, whether or not we even removed the student numbers from the actual migration figures, because student numbers are inevitably high. And post-pandemic, during the pandemic, people did not travel. So you had that pent-up demand of people actually needing to come back to finish their degree courses or go back to be educated. And these are students that obviously pay to come to the United Kingdom to go to these academic institutions and to do their degrees. Are we saying that was a wrong thing to do? In the same way, we now sort of like going to say we were wrong on the health and social care visas, on BNOs, on Ukraine, on Afghanistan. I just don't think that's right. I really don't. But it is about communications. I think people made a collective decision not to speak about migration, immigration within those sort of, separated terms.
So do you think if you were to become leader of the Conservative Party, would you bring the Rwanda policy back?
So I think we will need a third country deterrent of some shape or form. I don't know if Rwanda is going to be relevant or not.
Absolutely.
Sounds like this government has absolutely broken all bonds and bridges and common courtesies with the government of Rwanda, and I think they've treated them quite badly. It will be interesting, Ben. We could actually see a European country get there first on Rwanda. Because discussions are very active, even when I was negotiating our partnership.
Rishi talks a lot of this about during the election, right? Other European nations all of a sudden started saying we're going to copy what
So
the UK did.
It was taking place back in the day, back in 2020, before 2021. I had counterparts across Europe that were actively talking about this. And I would speak to all my counterparts across Europe because that's what you do when you're a government representative of the government. And you try and find common solutions sometimes and, learn from each other, which is why I spent so much time with my colleagues in Greece, looking at how they did pushbacks, turnbacks, built the reception centres. If you recall, possibly now 7, 8 years ago, maybe more than that, maybe 10 years ago, many of the Greek islands literally were turned over into shelters for refugees. You don't have that anymore because they have the accommodation centres. They process their claims behind in these centres,
Yep.
not in our local communities. And that's basically, those were the policies that I put forward. And as I said, I think we need to go back and look at them again.
I mean, we're not here just to talk about immigration, right? I mean, I invited you on, and thank you for accepting this, to talk about the fact that you are a leadership contender and you hope to lead the Conservative Party. I suppose using this as a platform where you're going to be being able to communicate directly with Conservative Home listeners as well as listeners of the Blueprint podcast. What does a Priti Patel Conservative Party look like if you become leader? What is your vision? And when people are stood on the doorstep and you ask them, what does the Conservative Party stand for under Priti Patel? What do you want them to say as an answer to that question?
I want the public to look at us, first of all, as a serious, professional political party that actually the public can trust all over again. Because we're not there. We're simply not
Absolutely,
there.
yeah.
We're not there right now. But in terms of direction of travel, it's got to be positive, inclusive, reaching out across the country. So wherever you are across the country, feeling that we're the party of hope and aspiration. If you want to get on in life, we're going to back you, basically. If you want to, get your kids into great schools and have choice in education, we're the party that's going to make that happen. If you want to set up a business or, do something different, have a career change, we are the ones that give you the good old-fashioned traditional ladder of opportunity to get on in life and have the freedom to succeed and live your life freely. We don't feel that way at all right now about our party. And certainly when we're up against a Labour government, when we look at how they're now going to strip away our freedoms, become much more centralised, control of the states, we're going to be so far removed from all of that. So we're going to have to absolutely create a new outward face, I think, a new vision for our country, but one that meets the genuine challenges that the British public and our nation faces today, tomorrow, and in the future.
So if you're walking down the street, I can't remember the name of the street where the shop was, but you walk into a shop and you see a 17, 18-year-old girl behind the counter helping the family, and you say, "Isn't it about time you join the Conservative Party?" How do you justify that? How do you sell that vision to a young person to feel like the Conservative Party is for them?
Well, I'd be asking that 17-year-old, what do you see yourself doing? What are your hopes and aspirations? What are your plans for the future, basically? And we need to be part of that. We can't just sort of say, well, that sounds very nice and then walk away. We need to be part of that to make it happen, make it a reality for that 17-year-old and many other 17-year-olds, including my 16-year-old and all his mates as well, because their success is the collective success of our country. And that's what we want. We absolutely want that. We really do. We used to be like that. We used to be associated, with those types of values, the energy, the passion, commitment. When I joined our party, we were the party of aspiration. We were the ones that, if you wanted to get on in life, absolutely go and join the Conservative Party. The one thing I would say that is very different to back then is that political party membership has changed. The whole concept has changed massively. You don't have to join our party, but you can associate with our values and beliefs and feel secure in the knowledge that they are shared values and that we're on your side, being on your side, not publicly, not massively publicly in an intrusive way, but knowing that you're going to get comfort and security with the Conservative Party and the way in which we will lead and run the country.
And I think it goes back a bit full circle to what we've already talked about on the episode, in that it feels to me like lots of young people today, particularly those under the age of 25, actually do instinctively identify with Conservative values, much more entrepreneurial than generations that came before them. But they don't. If you were to speak to your average, 20-year-old or 16, 17-year-old, they don't feel like they identify with the Conservative Party. So again, there's this whole brand communication point that the new leader's really going to have to get to grips with. How do we start to get the cross to those people and those young people that we are for them?
So I think it's about values. I really do, and their hopes and aspirations. And I know I say a lot about hopes and aspirations, but you don't have to join a political party to share the same, synergies and values and, vibes, I guess. But and this is where the gulf is just so enormous. We don't actually engage with young people.
And
we just don't engage with them.
Is that the fault of local associations?
All of us.
CCHQ?
All of us, Ben.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, I can't get away from it. I have a 16-year-old and everything that comes with it. And that is great. Honestly, the greatest thing is being a parent. But I think if, look at our outlook, we've been in government for 14 years. Perhaps we've just become, we've stopped understanding how to engage with young people. I've got to be really honest, our associations, I was at an event last night in Chester and it was just incredible. About 80 people there, plenty of young people, all of them saying, our values are the same, but, didn't vote Conservative at the last election.
Okay.
You know why? Because we didn't engage with them. We don't even think about speaking to them. We don't have the right, it's not about language. We just don't have find the right ways to, dare I say it, engage with them, invite them to things, if it's about inviting them things, or even going into areas where they are, to meet them and see them and engage with them and speak to them. I think perhaps he got stuck in a rut.
And I think you've said quite openly before that also starts with the reform of things like CCHQ. Mm-hmm. So again, I know and you know as well as I know, I mean, you are the perennial campaigner, right? You've been born of the Conservative Party for a lot longer than I have. But it's that perennial point that comes across from members. They don't feel engaged by CCHQ. They don't feel ownership of CCHQ, which is kind of the central part of their party. I know that's something close to your heart. How do you see that reform actually happening to be able to engage with young people, associations, and just members in general?
So we need to change CCHQ, basically.
Yeah.
It has become this sort of, centralised, blob or, an institution. An institution is a much kinder word, I think. A very centralised organisation, an institution that feels top down. And in my view, as leader of the party, I want to flip it around. We've got to be bottom up all over again. We've got to take that wonderful golden thread from the bottom of our party up to the top. And by that, I mean the people, the engagement, the ideas.
How do you do that?
People having their voices heard in our party. We just don't have that anymore. Our party membership, you'll know this, Ben, your membership fee, when you log on, where does it go? It used to go to the association when I first joined. Most of it now goes to the centre of the party.
Centralise the membership.
So centralising the membership, all of that kind of stuff. And there's reasons as to why that has happened. But we have to give our members their party back. We have to empower them. They need their voices back. They need to be listened to. I would say the same when it comes to policy development. We have the CPF on policy forums, which is very good. Make that much more inclusive. Bring it to party conference. Let the members have their members' day rather than come into party conference. And I know you've seen this. When we're in governments, it's very, very corporatist and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of corporates are there. Very few members come to party conference. It's their conference, for God's sake.
Yeah.
They should be there. And back in the day, actually, the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party used to be invited to come to conference. Now it's just like we all go and, give speeches and that's it. And we just sort of glad handle a few people. It's got to be much more inclusive. We've got to have events for members. We've got to let them have their say. I have spoken about having a democratically elected chair of our party.
Right.
I see no reason why not. Let's spend some time in opposition the next 6 to 12 months looking at how we can make that happen. So importantly, that democratically elected chair carries the voice of the grassroots and is represented at party board, in addition to the national convention and all the other structures that we have. This is a really important moment where we can give our party back to our members and our grassroots because they're feeling out of love with the centre of the party. And during the general election campaign, I visited about 18 constituencies. And more often than not, I think one of the untold stories about the election was the lack of activism. Our activists did not come out. Normally you'd come out to 10, 15, 20, 30 activists. More often than not, it was 4 or 5 people. So we need to get them remotivated, and we'll get them remotivated by giving them a say in our party, sense of direction of travel, knowing that they're not just being used to just stuff envelopes, knock on doors, but actually they're backed by a central party, a leadership that's going to listen to them, a shadow cabinet that is integral to listening to them, their own hopes and aspirations, the policy direction of travel. And I know that we can absolutely do this because we need to do it if we're going to win elections next year, county council elections, build the base, get more candidates standing for us, more people that want to come to represent our party locally and nationally. And this is how we're going to have to do it. It's not going to be easy, but we have to do it from the bottom up.
Absolutely, and I think a strong and reformed CCHQ and a kind of a redesign of how the party works from an activist-based point of view is going to be essential to that. I mean, I've always toyed on and off with the idea of a directly elected chairman. And to play devil's advocate for a minute, because it's something that goes around in my... instinctively, I kind of feel like, yeah, absolutely, as a member of the Conservative Party,
Sure.
that would give me a bit more direct ownership over the campaigning function of the Conservative Party. But then, obviously, and you'll have heard this a million times, the other side of that coin is, well, hang on, if you're directly electing the chairman of the Conservative Party, it creates a completely different power base to the leader of the Conservative Party, who is also, by the way, directly elected by the membership. And so do you not create a rod for your own back by, in effect, having, two leaders of the party with their own democratic mandate from members? Is there not a reform of the way we elect our chairman through the National Convention that would be more? Because I've been a member now, a lot less for you. I mean, when did I join the party? 2008, 2009. I personally couldn't tell you who is on the National Convention, what it does and how it operates. It feels to me, and I've kind of come to the conclusion, it would be a more sensible thing to do that. And I only say that rather than a directly elected chairman because of this issue of kind of power bases between the chairman and the leadership. You know, given that sounds like you're quite in favour of a directly elected chairman, how have you kind of squared that circle?
So I am pro more democracy in our party. I'll be very upfront about that. Most association members and association chairs don't even know about the National Convention.
Yeah, that is
and
true.
Actually,
Absolutely
the National
true.
Convention needs changing. It needs to be much more accountable and it's got to be much more inclusive. So I think reforms have to happen there as well. But also, to your point, using that word power base, I think actually we have to move beyond power base because we're a party that wants to get back into power and run the country again.
It's also politics, though, Priti. I mean, you know how some of our colleagues operate, sadly.
I'm sorry, but, we're not going to come back if people want to just sort of caucus and behave in that way. We have to be an integrated party and a united party. And this is one way I see that we can actually unite people and all structures in our party, make it much more transparent, make it much more accountable, make sure people's voices are heard. Because that hasn't been happening of late, and it hasn't happened for a long time.
Yeah.
And you mentioned power bases. Well, also using the patronage of the leader to appoint a chair of the party, just as a position to then get another position and a job. That is actually quite discourteous, I think, to our membership and our grassroots. We are not one party anymore. And this is one way in which we can be an integrated party through reform of all our structures, reform of CCHQ, changes to the National Convention, absolutely, but letting our members have their voices heard through an elected chair.
I mean, I think a lot of members will strongly welcome that message, to be fair, Priti, so hopefully they'll be listening to this. I mean, as we come towards the end of the episode, thank you again for coming on to the Blueprint podcast. How do you think the leadership campaign's going so far?
So it's great fun, actually. It's really...
I bet it is. Particularly as somebody who likes to get out and around the country.
That is me. I always say
absolutely.
I'm from the party, for the party. And, we're going to the hustings as well. I'm seeing so many friends that perhaps I would see at party conference. I, hope to see them at party conference as well. But it speaks to the Conservative family. And this is a very uplifting process, actually, because it's bringing people together. And I speak about unity because that is exactly where we have to be. That is definitely where we have to be. I'm hearing universally as well that the membership are quite unhappy about duration of the campaign, and perhaps this comes back to having a democratically elected chair, not having their voices heard.
Were you hearing that they wanted to go longer, or
no? I'm hearing that they would like to have the first vote in this contest, and they don't think it should be the members of Parliament.
Oh, so you're hearing that members want to take that away from the MPs.
So they would like the first vote, not take it away from the MPs, but help to whittle it down early on, rather than, to quote what I'm hearing, rather than be given the sort of fait accompli that comes afterwards. But, we're an open party. I'm speaking about more democracy in our party as well.
Absolutely.
So, we welcome all views because we're going to have to work together and work with all people. So it's been really quite... It's been interesting, actually, I think. Energising, all the rest of it, yes. But interesting just to hear people's views post the general election.
Yeah.
Where they stand, how the election was for them. People are much more open. By this, I mean,
I think
members.
people have found it quite a cathartic exercise,
I think
actually.
so, yeah.
And I think it's something we need to go through. And it's been, I mean, when you came with the other candidates to the North East hustings, that was kind of with Yorkshire as well, I found that there were some very challenging questions, but it wasn't because they didn't like any particular candidate, but they used it as that ability to be able to talk to the party that they felt like they'd become slightly disconnected from. And I think this is the issue for all of the contenders, in that you have this where the membership, I think, have some quite clear views. I think actually the membership are much more sensible and fair-minded than people outside of the Conservative Party realise. But there is this tension with the Parliamentary Party, right? And the Parliamentary Party have the first shot at the process, in effect, of whittling it down first to 5 and then 4, and then ultimately that'll go through to conference and then down to 2, really with the members deciding the ultimate choice. How do you find that in the leadership contest at the minute? Because, like I say, you're an incredible campaigner. Your base is always about membership. You talked about democratisation of the party, but we can't get away from kind of the elephant in the room, which is, well, actually, the first part of the process is largely with the parliamentary parliament.
That's the rules. That is the process, and that is all fine. What I think is really interesting about this contest thus far, we're 121 MPs, and we've got thousands upon thousands, God bless them, party members. So we need to bring the two together. We really do. And this is going to be a pivotal moment in the Conservative Party, where our MPs will be listening much more to the grassroots, the membership, the people that
they will?
The people that have felt that they've been left behind.
Apologies to interrupt, but I think we've seen this in previous leadership elections. I would say certainly post 2019, after Boris, what happened with Liz and Rishi, it kind of felt to me like the Parliamentary Party had a very definite view, which I don't think necessarily aligned with the membership, never mind necessarily the country at large. Yeah. Do you think the Parliamentary Party are in a different place now, where they are going to listen more to the membership rather than what's historically happened, which is, as an outsider to the Commons, it feels to me like sometimes the Parliamentary Party thinks they know better than the membership. Do you think that's switched now?
So I think it's changing.
Okay.
That's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm seeing, and that's what I'm hearing. I think it has to change. I really do. As I said, 121 Conservative members of Parliament. We want more, but thousands upon thousands of members. This is their moment to have their voices heard, and I think that's really important. And as I've said, the members are angry. We're hearing all sorts of views from them, which is great. I think it's absolutely right and proper we listen to them. They're cross about everything that has happened over recent years in Parliament, and they're cross at the members of Parliament as well. There's no question about that. Even the poor new intake who, are probably feeling sort of, in the crosswinds on this. But this is a moment for the grassroots, I think, to really make sure that their voices are heard through their MPs, because the process is defined. The rules are set, and that is fine. Everyone just goes along with that. No issue about that at all. But this is the time for the members, and that's why this summer, I think, has been so pivotal. Yes, with hustings, meeting associations, for the grassroots to feel engaged, that had to happen. And I think for that to happen now is really important, that our Conservative members of the party listen to the voices of the grassroots. Because quite frankly, without our grassroots, we're not going to get more Conservative Party MPs elected in Parliament going forward.
Which, Priti, as you know, is exactly what we're all about, to be able to change the country for the better. So thank you very much, Priti. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and good luck with the contest.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Blueprint podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home with me, Ben Houchin. Remember, you can like and subscribe on all of our social media channels, and you can catch a new episode every single Wednesday wherever you get your usual podcasts from.